Okay, so we are live on YouTube now. And let me get this link to copy it out. Live. Okay. Share. All right. We're figuring this out together as we go. All right.
Trial and error, man. Trial and error.
All right. Tweets going out. Let's see. And all right. This is showing live at 9:45. And it looks like we're live. All right. It looks like we got a couple of people rolling in. All right, good evening. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of the Bozi Breakdown. Tonight, I am joined by Colin Fern, who is very familiar with success at Talladega. So I thought, who better to bring in here to talk about Superspeedway Aero? We got a lot to discuss. Namely, we just got notice from NASCAR that Joey Logano and Ryan Preece were disqualified. Colin's also an aspiring producer, content creator with Shake and Bake Sports. So He's got some really cool stuff he's doing with a bunch of Xfinity guys that have a little personality. So we have a lot of commonalities. I feel like I'm coming from the creator space. He's coming from the technical space, and we're kind of meeting somewhere in the middle. Hi, Colin.
That's exactly right. Thanks for having me, Bozi.
All right. So we'll dig right into it. Talladega, let's just get into some of the basics to explain to people why the race the way it did, while some of these other people flow in to ask questions, get into disqualification. So I think a lot of people were frustrated today of like, hey, these guys are all in a line. Like, why is that happening, and why doesn't Xfinity race the same way?
Well, the biggest thing is the length of the stages, right? And the size of the fuel tanks. Like, these guys are going to save as much as they can to keep the pit stop time as little as possible, right? So you can't blame them for, I mean, they're playing the shoe that fits them. So it's like, what can we do to make them have to race? I don't have the correct answer, right? I was always taught, if you don't have a suggestion, don't bring up a problem, but make the fuel tank smaller, make the stages shorter, add in a couple extra stages, do something to force these guys to race. I put out a tweet 30 laps in, and it's like it's watching a football game where they're going half speed and not wearing pads for the first 3 quarters. It's essentially it's frustrating as a race fan, right? Sure. You can't blame the teams, you can't blame the drivers. They're playing the hand that's dealt.
Yeah, that's tough, and that's kind of the thing. I think we saw some of the Toyotas kind of try to take a different path there, and it worked out a couple of times. I think in stage 1 they did it, and stage 2 they did it, where they're like, all right, everybody's just kind of cruising around, whatever, half throttle, whatever it is, and they're like, we're just going to ramp it up and see if we get a response. And it seemed to work out, but somehow at the end it just didn't work out. And I think part of it was obviously that when the Toyotas pitted and all came out, they ran into traffic, namely Ross Chastain for a bit there. But I think even without that, I think the Fords may have just out-strategized them there on that last run.
Yeah, and there's a lot of strategy that goes into Talladega. Like, you think back to the road courses back before stage racing, like you're calling the race backwards. So These engineers, right, we talk to JR a lot, but these guys are calling the race from the backwards as if there's not going to be a yellow. They're planning it that the only yellows we're going to get are the stage breaks. So what is the fastest route from the start of stage 3 to the checkered flag? And that's what these guys are doing, right? Toyota thought maybe they could get away, which is fair, right? At those tracks, 6 to 10 cars in a line going 100%, they got the sim on that stuff, so they can see if that's going to be faster, and that's the route they took. And obviously the save and fuel strategy played out for the Fords until it didn't in Tech.
Well, and I think it's kind of like a seesaw effect of basically you can gain this many seconds on pit lane, or you can gain this many seconds going fast, and you're trying to figure out where it's going to lean while also accounting for all these other possibilities of you might have a big one, you might not, like we saw today, which was kind of surprising. So seems like there's all these little bits and pieces.
Right. And obviously, like you said, there's so many factors that go into it, right? If they go catch the 78 and the 62, they're riding out there, 2 car lengths apart. If one of them locks the tires up and can't do fuel only on pit entry, if one of them speeds, I mean, those 8 cars can funnel down to 4 really quick, and then the whole strategy's shot.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, especially for, going back to the Toyotas and them attempting this alternate strategy, they're smaller in numbers compared to the other OEMs. And they've only recently had the opportunity to even try something like this, because in the past, there might have been 4 or 5 cars, and now they actually have more. And it's like, just the energy of having all those cars, just like we see with the different lanes moving faster or slower, it can change very quickly.
And I think, if I remember correctly, they tried this strategy maybe a year or two ago at Talladega, and they wrecked each other. And I think this is the same strategy that they tried, and I think they finally thought about doing it again with a few more cars.
Yeah, I think that was the one where EJ ended up in the wall, like an angle that looked really bad. Yeah, that was a tough one because they were kind of just hauling, and then it just all went wrong, and 3 or 4 cars got into each other, and then then you're kind of stuck if you only have 3 or 4 cars left, because you just got to rely on anybody you can find.
Yeah, and I think this next gen era of speedway racing, right, it reminds me a lot of truck racing. When they are going 100%, it's hard to get that third lane going if the first 2 lanes are going 100%. You're kind of gridlocked, and it's a lot of track position. And these guys are going to do everything they can to. I mean, you saw it Saturday in the Xfinity race with the RCR car. As soon as they hit their fuel window, they were on pit road, because if it comes out, they're getting back up front.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's something that I think is kind of a good thing to mention with the way the trucks are and the, Gen 7 next gen cars are. Like, the drag profile of something like an Xfinity car versus a truck or a next gen is like, it's probably a closer comparison to always use a truck when talking about this stuff, because, the Gen 7 is so draggy. So that's an apt comparison. And then that's we'll get into the Xfinity stuff later, but now that we have some people rolling into the room, we'll go back to what just happened post-race. So we have 2 different disqualifications that came through. So the number 60 of Ryan Preece got disqualified on 14.5.8F. The number 22 of Joey Logano got disqualified on 14.5.8.E. So E is related to the spoiler shims. F is related to the spoiler braces. So we'll talk about the one and then talk about the other. So we'll start with the number 22, and I'll go over here to rule E and just give a quick reading. So what it says is basically, for super speedway events, spoiler braces must be used. Spoiler braces must be painted black. Spoiler braces must consist of the parts outlined in this table. And there's a table here that basically shows deck lid, spoiler, and then an L-shaped brace with a reinforcement on the side to basically hold the spoiler at a right angle to the deck lid. So that was rule E. That was a failure for Joey Logano. So in order to understand what we have going on there, I think we have to just get into the goal for super speedway races first, and what NASCAR does intense checks on with the spoiler, and why the spoiler angle is so important. So what happens if we let the spoiler lean back a little bit?
Well, I mean, everything's going to happen, right? You're going to lose less drag. You're going to be faster down the straightaway. You're going to save more fuel. I mean, all of the above. I got the dog jumping up here now. So all of the above.
this is officially our 3rd guest right now. So this is the 3rd person to ever appear on this show. So this is cool. Yeah, we love dogs, so this is good.
But yeah, it's everything that you want at a speedway is going to get better with the spoiler flatter, right? And I think it happened in a truck race a decade ago with the 15 Waltrip, right? Half of his spoiler came down. Nobody can get near him, right? So it's harder to break through that bubble with the lower spoiler. It makes you faster down the straightaway. It saves fuel. Every benefit that you want at a speedway is increased with the spoiler flatter.
So obviously, talking about some of the old stuff where it was, visually laid down, this isn't as visible, but just like anything else in race cars, small fractional changes can still have an impact. So this spoiler brace on the 22, basically, if you're looking at the back of the car, there's a deck lid and there's a spoiler that kind of stands almost upright from the deck lid. And I think it was maybe a year or 2 ago that NASCAR fully required these specific braces. But basically, it's just like a right angle bracket you would have for a shelf in your house that just bolts. One bolt bolts to the spoiler and another one bolts to the deck lid. And my understanding is that one of these bolts was missing when they inspected the car after the race.
Yeah, so, and that's the tough thing, right? Is that, I'm sure we'll get into it, but at 190, 200 miles an hour, these cars are getting sandblasted, right? It could be literally anything that affects this brace. And we'll get into my frustrations with the pre-race tech, but anything could happen. But with a speedway race, they're not going to have any leniency.
Yeah, and I think that's the big deal. Just from my limited personal experience of going through Cup Tech, is that part at Daytona especially was very, very significant with the templates they have, the weights they put on the spoiler, like deflection is very, very important. So something like that bolt, which my guess, if it's just one bolt, is they're going to try to appeal it, because they might go back to say, hey, there's rocks being pelted. There was a car that had a bird flying to the windshield. There's vibrations. So they do have some reasoning that they could use there, but also super speedway events are stricter than most, I think, with a lot of this stuff related to aero.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story about Daytona. One time we went down there, and I won't say who the crew chief or anything like that was, but we went down there with a bunch of loose washers, right? They give you the spoiler when you get there, you put them on and you leave everything a little loose. Well, when you finish tech, they don't let you touch the spoiler. You have to be seat post forward at speedways. Well, I'm sitting there in my little Polo, and I didn't touch the cars. So this crew chief was just like, hey, when we're going to tech, go back there and, it's a 12-to-1 box, thing rolls great. Go back there and just give it a little tug until someone tells you to stop. So I was like, okay. And I went back there, and I probably got a good 15, 20 seconds on it before somebody was like, hey, C-post. I'm like, God, sounds good. But they don't mess around with the speedway stuff. Like, you can't do anything that's gonna, any sort of advantage. They're not gonna put up with it.
I learned that same lesson, not for those reasons, just because I didn't know. So the first ever Cup race I did as a mechanic was the Daytona 500. Yeah. So we had passed tech, we're rolling out, and my background working in IMSA and working in sports cars is, we have wings, so you're not messing with it. Like, they just don't want you to touch the wing, but you can put your hands on the deck lid because you're 4 inches below the wing. Right. So that's what I'm doing. So we're pushing the car out of tech to go qualify for the Daytona 500, and I'm just basically like the TV panel, like the area below the deck lid. I'm just pushing back there because that's where I'm used to pushing in sports cars. And one of the officials like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm pushing the car." He's like, "You go over there." I was like, "All right, cool." He's like, "From now on," he's like, "this is your go and no-go zone." He's like, the C-post right here, you don't walk past here. The rest of this car doesn't exist for you when you're touching it. I was like, all right, cool. So that goes back to that same deal. But that's kind of where NASCAR would be coming from, is, hey, you have this piece loose. It might be an incremental advantage, but because everything's so tight here, we're talking about this specific type of racing where, everybody's in a column. You're trying to save fractions of a gallon of fuel. You're trying to get, 10th here, a 10th there on speed. If you can lay the spoiler down even, a half a degree to one angle or the other, you can change that airflow and get some sort of benefit. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach it. Obviously, it's Penske, so they'll probably have binders full of reasoning to take to an appeal, and I would assume that they would appeal it. But there's, two big sides here. Like, hey, here's where we're looking at it, and I understand where NASCAR is coming from and why they would penalize this and immediately penalize it, especially if it's something as apparent as a piece of hardware missing. Right. Considering, like even your example story and other stories of things being left loose on purpose and to gain an advantage. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach it, and what they get into with that. But I'm sure middle of this week, we'll probably hear about an appeal.
And I think that's important to touch on real quick with the appeal process. I don't know what it is for Cup. I know for truck, it's 2,500. For Xfinity, it's 5,000. Well, that's pennies when you're talking about, finishing third and fourth, Cup race. Like, I'm assuming it's the same increment, so it's probably 10 grand to appeal. That's a no situation. You should appeal it even if you were caught cheating dead right.
Yeah, I mean, that for somebody, an organization of that size, that's an easy choice to be able to go and appeal that, especially because the gain could be so huge, not only from the points in the race, but the prize money would immediately wash all of that out from, going from, being, the top 5 or wherever it was down to 38th, and then being able to go back up there just with how big the differences are. So that's, that'll be interesting there. So now we shift over to the number 60 of Ryan Preece. So he is on the same page, which, coincidentally is fascinating, but that's because spoilers are very important. So they take a closer look at it. So section F of that rule says the spoiler may be shimmed between the polycarbonate face and the base. If shims are used, gaps will not be permitted between the spoiler face and the spoiler base. The spoiler face must be flush to the base at either the top or bottom, depending on the angle change required. For super speedway events, a maximum of 2 full-width, single-piece graduated carbon fiber shims will be the only permitted method of altering spoiler angle. The spoiler shims must conform to the following drawing and CAD files, and there's basically a couple of files here showing these almost banana-shaped pieces that fit under the spoiler. So this one here, from my understanding of the failure, was that they had too many shims. So that again goes back to angle. So I believe this is, the maximum for super speedways is 2 full width shims. And they likely had 3 or maybe more. I don't know the exact number, but they changed where the spoiler sits in relation to, the deck lid and the spoiler base. So what would be the reasoning here? Because this one I find a little bit harder to appeal because you have a physical extra part.
So the first question I would ask is, are those shims from a single source supplier?
So they have a CAD in the rule book for the teams to make. So that was the first thing I looked at too. So it's a team part. So if it was a single source supplier, that's always an easy thing. But no, there is a CAD file in the rule book that if I can pull up here, let's see. But there's a CAD file for both types of the shims available, and there's like a small and a large, and they give you some examples of how to put them together. But no, it's that part. Let's see here. Yeah, shims, hardware, all this other stuff, everything in that rule looks to be mostly team supplied, and all it says is there's a maximum of 59 inches wide and a width of 48 max for the tall shim, and a 4.88 max for the tall shim, and then it shows a cross section of how it can be graduated. So that's that seems like a tougher one than the missing bolt that, for at least from my perspective. I don't know like what your argument might be there if you have extra pieces in the car.
I can't think of one off the top of my head, right? Like, if these pieces are reused, maybe they get put in a parts cleaning washer, and when you put them away, they get stuck together. Like I don't.
Yeah. That's the
benefit to that, right, is I'm assuming it was probably the right side, right? And so down the straightaway and in the corners, these guys are peeking off to the right side. So if they're making the right side of the spoiler a little flatter, even if a tenth of a degree, right, you're getting more airflow to go over the spoiler, less drag, saving more fuel. It's really no benefit to leading a line or by yourself, but I think in the pack it can help a handful of situations, right? So argument-wise, good luck. Right?
Yeah, it's tough, man. That's kind of the thing here. It's like it's not a huge gain, but because of the nature of the current form of racing, it could also be a decent small gain if you can save a little more fuel than the next guy. And I think that's kind of a good segue into our next topic of like a lot of it came down to how well your fueler plugged in,
right?
And how much time you spend on pit lane. And I think that's where some of this stuff comes into effect. Is it may not seem like you're getting an extra 2 miles an hour when you're out leading, but if you can save a lap worth of fuel over the even though if it's over the course of an entire race, that's whatever amount of time that you'll be able to save on pit lane. And
Absolutely.
looking at it, I saw like that last cycle, like Cindric might have been surprising for some people, but it actually makes sense if you look at some of the numbers and like where they ended up, because Andrew Lackey is the fueler on the number 2, and he was plugged in for 3.26 seconds. And most of the fuelers on that last cycle were plugged in somewhere in that 3.5 to 5.5 second range, depending on how much they needed. But on top of that, Cindric had a rolling time on pit lane of 24.5 seconds. So it was about 27.8 seconds between the stop and the rolling time on pit lane. But the other 5 cars, which originally finished in the top 5, no longer, were all over 28 seconds. So that doesn't seem like a lot, but those 2 or 3 tenths of a second that saved on pit lane put him out front of that group.
Yeah, I mean, I saw someone posted a picture, right, with the whole field within 1.2 seconds of each other. So you talk a couple tenths. I mean, that's 15% of the field you just jumped, right? Obviously, it's a little different situation, but theoretically, when you look at just straight time over distance, 2 tenths is worth 15 spots when they're racing, 3 or 4 wide.
Yeah, and that's all you need in some of these situations is you just need a chance to be in those first couple of rows. So it's, if you can make it forward. So that part wasn't surprising. We also saw some bobbles there. Ken Purcell, who's the fueler on number 11 of Denny Hamlin, he's highly experienced, multi-time champion, worked with Jimmy Johnson. He's been around the sport forever. But on that last stop, he missed a plug, and he had to do a sidestep and re-plug in, and that was probably a second or so while that happened. So then they were plugged in. I think they started their iPad before he was fully in, and then he left pit lane, and they're like, we're short. So it's like, it's just those small things that can make a difference.
In getting that fuel can plugged in, I would put it right up there with hitting a fastball, hitting a golf ball, hitting a 3-point jumper. Like, that is one of the hardest things to do in our sport, right? That car is coming in at Talladega, I guess, 59.99 miles an hour coming down pit road.
Yep.
And it's coming to a stop in 80 feet. And you have to be within, I mean, there's no off. Yeah. Like, if you're a millimeter off, like, it doesn't plug. So to be in the right spot, your driver hit the mark exactly right, have the angle of the can up here where you need it, and for it to plug and to know, I mean, obviously your crew chiefs and engineer know exactly how much time, but he's just plugging. And then when that time hits, like, he's got to be off, right? Because if it stays engaged and takes off, that's a pass through. So that has to be, like, I would never want to do it, but it has to be one of the most difficult jobs down pit road, is a fuel only stop at a speedway in the last stage.
Yeah, I've fueled in IMSA, and it's stressful even there, even with minimum refuel time, where you can plug in for what seems like forever, but trying to do it in 3 seconds is just incredibly hard. And I think a lot of people would default to, like, hey, he made a mistake or whatever, but there's so many elements at play, because you're trying to hop over at the right time, so you're not too early. So you're watching the car coming, from a few boxes away, while also trying to be focused on where you are, while holding a 92-pound fuel can on your shoulder. And then when you come in, if the car slides in the box or stops short or stops long or does whatever than what's expected, or goes through the board, then there's nothing you can do. Even if you as a fueler did everything absolutely correct, all it takes is the driver sliding by half a foot, and everything's out of play. And it's I think that's something that people TV might show one thing, or might be just a little bit of detail, but it's not something I would put on the fueler. Like, the fuelers, obviously everybody makes mistakes, but in this situation, I think there's multiple factors that could have happened. And in the end, it didn't make a huge difference because of where that group that Denny was in ended up when they came upon Chastain on track and lost some momentum there. But that's like, pit lane was very chaotic. I think these super speedway races, even though it's not all out speed when it comes to the tires, like, the fuel stuff is getting really, really intense.
And I would argue the fuelers' importance at Daytona and Talladega is equivalent to the rest of the pit crew at every other racetrack, right? The fueler, we don't talk about the fueler at most places, right? Every time you come down and get fuel, pit stops are 7, 8, 9 seconds these days. You're going to take tires every time you come in for fuel at most places, right? But Daytona and Talladega, where literal tenths are multiple positions.
Yeah.
Like the fielder's job is, I mean, he's the quarterback that day, right? So if quarterback's offensive line doesn't block, if everyone doesn't do their job, the execution's not there, right? So, and I love explaining pit crews like football players to people that don't know NASCAR, because that's essentially what it is, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it's an entire offense.
No, that's absolutely great. And I'm big on trying to find analogies to a lot of stuff. And I think it leads back to another pit crew issue from today, where I tried to use bowling as an example. So Jarius Moorhead is the tire carrier on the 77 for Hocevar. Hocevar came in at an angle for one of the stops late in the race, and Jarius ran out as he usually does to do the 4-tire change. And another car was coming by, and as Jarius was coming out with both of his tires, the car hit one of the tires that Jarius was holding with the left front fender, because the two cars were so tight. The tire bounced off the fender, hit him in the ribs, and like knocked him onto the hood of the car that he was servicing. And then he took like not even a whole second to catch his breath, ran over, grabbed the tire, put the tire on the car, ran over to the other side, grabbed another tire, did the inside front, and the car took off, and he went over. And what I was saying in my tweet is, this is a 50-pound tire, and like an average bowling ball I think is like 11 or 12 pounds. So like I want people to imagine that this thing going at his ribs is about the equivalent of somebody taking 4 bowling balls, putting them into one object, and then bouncing them off a 3,500-pound car and then back into your ribs. Like this is like some of the stuff these guys deal with.
So on that note, obviously the wheels are lighter, right, than they used to be. Do you think that tire bounces like that if it's the heavier wheel, or do you think it absorbs more contact into the fender?
I think part of it is probably the car itself versus what previous cars were, sheet metal versus composite. So the sheet metal might have just dented into the car versus the composite's kind of bouncy. But the way he was with both cars just kind of basically right on edge of each other, it literally it was in his hands and it just bounced like right back up. So there wasn't any place for it to go. It's just like getting sideswiped is how it hit him. So and I know Jarius is a good dude, but he's very like, they put him on TV like a lap later. He's like, how you doing? He's like, I'm great. And I was like, I know that he's probably feeling great in the moment, because I've done dumb things and had other people do things to me when I have adrenaline going. Everything feels good. But I sent him a message. I was like, how you feeling? He's like, well, the ribs kind of hurt now. And it's like, yeah. So it's but that's kind of what these guys are dealing with. So in addition to all this other pressure of trying to get stuff like in fractions of a second, you're also trying to make sure you don't get run over by a car that's potentially doing 59.99 miles per hour.
And that's the crazy thing, right? It's not Martinsville where they're going 35. And you don't think there's a big difference until you've been on pit road when them pacing at Daytona or Talladega. Those cars are hauling ass. Like they are flying down pit road. Like they're going highway speeds. And these guys are just running out in front of them. It's crazy to me.
And that's the thing is, like, if you've never been like on pit lane in a NASCAR race, like the like differential of speed like may not seem that big on TV, but what I tell people is if you stand on a sidewalk on an average city street, they're going maybe 35 miles an hour passing by you. So this is like highway speeds at a place like Talladega. It's like just stand on like watch I-77 from the side, and you'll get pretty close to what these guys are running out into by choice.
Yeah, it's insane. I'm looking at the comments here.
All right, let's see what we got.
Penske's not appealing? Let's
see. Oh, really? Let's see.
They'd be the one I thought would be.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that would be the one, but maybe they made an announcement already. That is pretty quick. Let's see. Maybe. That is fascinating. I'm trying to see. Let's see. Yeah, I haven't actually. Oh, wow. There is a statement 9 minutes ago. The number 22 Team Penske Ford Mustang was disqualified following post-race inspection at Talladega today. One of the 18 bolts on the surface of the spoiler that connect to the base was found to be loose, and NASCAR penalized the team as a result. This was not intentional and happened throughout the course of the race event. Team Penske accepts the disqualification. Wow, that is pretty surprising. I would think that something like that, you try to like at least get people in your favor, especially for that car, because I mean, wherever he is in the points, he's not probably where they want to be. So you want to try to get whatever you can. But
I do love the little backhand in the statement. Like, one of the 18 votes was deemed to lose.
Yeah,
like,
which is
love that.
Yeah, like that's like, just adding a little zing to it, because if you don't know what you're looking at, like the spoiler face and the spoiler base and all those pieces, like there's a bunch of bolts there that connect all of it. So they decided to just list out all of them just to make sure that they prove their point of like, we don't really think we did anything bad, but we're not going to appeal, which is really surprising. That's
and that's something I wanted to touch on too, is the pre-race inspection, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Like, we'll just jump back to last week in Rockingham.
Mm-hmm.
When the two got DQ'd, well, their car passed pre-race inspection. So something happened, whether it was malicious, whether it was damage, whether anything happened. It was good pre-race. Yeah. So I get frustrated when we have a sanctioning body that more or less half-asses a pre-race tech and says you're good to go on track. But when you come back through here, everything better be 100% legal. So we either need to be 100% teching pre-race, right, which is going to take more time, which Cup guys, they're at the track 12 of 48 hours on a weekend, so it's not as big of a deal.
Yeah.
Xfinity guys, that's cuts into another travel day, and let's make sure these cars are 100% legal, or let's not tear them down after the race.
Yeah.
That just doesn't seem fair to me, to the teams, right? Whether, like, I'm sure the 22's spoiler brace was 100% tight at the beginning of the race. I'm 100% certain of it, right?
Sure.
So how do you – I mean, that's a huge penalty. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars in a full race worth of points over a loose bolt.
Yeah. And that's kind of why I said, especially in that scenario, I'm surprised that they're not appealing. So, and there's another commenter here that says maybe they have something bigger they don't want NASCAR to see. So that's actually, I think, is a good point. That would be the one reason I could think of. We don't want you to go through all this and for us to file this appeal. We just want our car back. So that's that could be the potential there. And going back to Rockingham, I see both points, and I agree with you that maybe there are certain things that could be more extensive in pre-race, because I think a lot of stuff on the race weekend now has just been kind of pared down to be as efficient as possible. Just, we got to get in, we got to get out. And I think that's one of the things that I found trying to just work on stuff in NASCAR is, like, it doesn't seem like a lot of people that do some of these individual tasks, like some of the mechanics and even some of the engineers, get a lot of satisfaction of throughout the weekend, because whatever you bring to the track, you're kind of stuck with because you have a limited amount of time. So inspection seems to be kind of the same way. They try to do the best they can with whatever time they have allotted per car. And I actually went to NASCAR R&D a few months ago. I did a story on the Hawkeye. It's like a 6-page story, like in depth about all the inspection stuff for race car engineering, because NASCAR has basically the most efficient advanced body scanning system like in the world. Like, they have a more efficient system than Formula One, which is kind of neat because of all this stuff that, like, they have to monitor at these very small tolerances. So in Formula One, they have these like laser and optical scanners, but it takes like 3 hours to scan one car. So they just pick 2 random cars on every race weekend, where NASCAR, because of the Hawkeye, scans the whole field multiple times. So, and I asked them about some of these things. They're like, hey, like, this stuff comes up, like, why aren't you guys checking in pre-race? And a lot of it basically is, comes down to time, but some of it also comes down to materials and things changing, especially for Xfinity and trucks, where teams can still build a lot of parts. And I understand that angle of it too, of like, hey, if you have metallurgy that can change somehow during the race, or if you have, a washer that can crush or whatever else that can move around, for them, I think it would open up a Pandora's box if they said, whatever we do pre-race is all we're going to do. And I think that's where that argument comes back.
I think it's a little different series to series, right? In Xfinity, I guess not really, but there's 4 things you don't mess with, right? You don't mess with the motor, you don't mess with the body, you don't mess with rear toe, and you don't mess with the spoiler. Like those are the 4 things. Everything else kind of is what it is. So if you don't mess with those 4 things, you're never going to get in big trouble. I mean, you look at every penalty in the past 2 decades, I bet you they all fall into those 4 categories. So if you want to get away with something, I'd probably stay far away from those 4 things.
Yeah. And that's kind of, we've seen it even in the Cup Series with single source parts. Legacy Motor Club, whenever this Gen 7 car came out, they figured they could mess with rear toe with, a combination of parts that were available. And it was like a literal overnight rule change because they're like, we saw you guys do this in practice. This cannot happen. And there was a bulletin at 1 a.m., it's like 7 hours after practice finished because they figured out how to tweak rear toe with parts that were available off the shelf. So that's how serious they are about, stuff like that. And, obviously the body work too. So that's kind of the balance you have to strike is, you have all these things that you can check, but even if you check all of them, there's still that window of like, hey, maybe if this heats up, it'll do this, or if maybe you get this pressure on that, it'll do that. And that's where, they're in a tough spot. And I think with a lot of it's also like the staffing, like there's a limited amount of technical inspectors that NASCAR has. So there's only so much they can do at the track itself. And, the post-race teardown process is probably 2 hours per car or something like that. Yeah. So if you have 40 cars, you have to tech times 2 or times 3 series, that would add up to a lot. But I also think that there are certain things that you want to try to nip in the bud if you can before the race, so you avoid discussions like this of like, hey, we saw these guys finish. Because how would it be now if Preece had made it across the line ahead of Cindric, and then we get post race, he goes to victory lane just like we had with Love at Rockingham, and then 2 hours later they're like, yep, nope, that doesn't count, this other guy's the winner that's already on the plane.
Right. So that's actually something I'd be very curious about too, to know. Obviously at 200 miles an hour, it's different, right? But when they rolled through the OSS in post-race tech, did the spoiler angles show different? Did the spoiler height show any different? I'd be very curious to know that, right? Because obviously you go at 190 miles an hour and something's loose, it's going to collapse, right? But is that something where they thought, okay, well, it's going to read fine in the OSS? It's going to work fine through there? Maybe they won't see it in post-race or whatever else. And that's another thing about how loose it is. And that makes me, I just thought of it, probably makes me think something did pop up on the OSS for the 22. When you do tear down, your guys are the one loosening everything and tearing it down. So it actually made me think the 22 probably had something in the OSS that said, hey, the spoiler's knocked back, this 100th of a degree. And then NASCAR probably went and looked at it.
Yeah, and I think that's the double-edged sword of the OSS in post-race, because one thing, it can reveal differences from pre-race, or even if it's just out of spec from what the CAD will have. But the OSS is also often used as a way to avoid post-race tech. If you've been in an incident and you go through the OSS and the car is damaged badly enough that it's not even in the window, you can use that as reasoning of like, hey, we got hit from the front, we got hit from the rear, we patched this thing together, and you can obviously see that we got damaged. So, they're like, all right, so that's something like, especially like in the case for, like what we saw at Rockingham, like if they had shown up with, damage on the quarter panels and the rear bumper or whatever, they could say, well, we got hit, stuff got bent, and they probably wouldn't even check, what the shims looked like at the U-bolt. Like that's, so, it works both ways.
Yeah, and that's something like when we won Talladega with Brandonville in 22, 21, whatever it was, we had tons of nose damage, right? They wrecked, and Brandon had cut across the apron to miss the wreck and broke the spoiler braces outside, or the splitter braces outside.
Splitter brace.
Splitter, yeah. So there's 2 splitter bolts missing. Our splitter is hanging like that on the front. And so we go to post-race tech, and this is before they did, I can't remember, they did it backwards. They switched it in 22, but it was either OSS and then heights and weights, or heights and weights then OSS. But when we were way too low in the front because of the damage. And we were like, listen, there's damage, got the clip, show them the clip. And they're like, okay, we'll just go to OSS. And it was like, it wasn't a big thing, which again goes to, if you can show something happened in the moment, they probably go on. And that goes back to the spoiler being one of the 4 things you just don't touch.
And that's I think, and let me see here. I think there's some other cars. So they have, this is engine dyno. So they're taking the 5, the 10, the 21, and the 23 to R&D for engine dyno. And then looks like 5 and the 21 are also going to be doing like a standard teardown inspection at R&D. So, going back to what Dennis said here in the comments, since the 21's going back to R&D for teardown, maybe Penske just didn't want to open up Pandora's box trying to do this appeal. So there's, I think there's some possibilities there. So that's a good note of like something that might be a potential there. So I'll be interested to see what RFK does with the shim, because somebody asked here about Chase Briscoe's spoiler hole appeal, which they did get granted their way. Is maybe, you going back to spoiler shims or whatever, if there's stuff that somehow didn't match or there's some reasoning that they can come up with. That's kind of what happened with Briscoe and what they argued. So with Briscoe, it was the spoiler face and the spoiler base bolting together, and some of the holes were wallowed out. And NASCAR failed them for, hey, this stuff is modified. So what JGR argued was like, hey, you have these, 16 or whatever bolts that you have to put in at the same time, and you're trying to tighten them bit by bit because you have 2 single source parts that come from different places, and you're trying to, line up these bolts that are in kind of a matrix. And if you tighten them, all, time here or there, occasionally you get some wear. And that was enough of an argument to, for the appeal board to say, hey, we get what you're saying. You didn't try to like machine these out. Like you were just trying to tighten all the bolts. And as you were tightening them, like one side pulled a little bit this way or that way. Right. And that's probably why you asked if it was a single source part for, for those shims. So, yeah, but unfortunately for RFK, it's a team part. So it'll be a hard thing to argue here, but they haven't announced anything yet. It was just, I feel like this Penske announcement that they are not going to appeal, like came like 15 or 20 minutes after the whole thing came out, which was like fascinating, like, because what it's like for these decision processes to happen on the technical side, and then for that to get over to the PR people or whoever else, like that's pretty quick. Like that they're just like, no, we're not going to do it.
Someone called Roger and he said, let's just go. Like that's let's not mess with it. I think you go back to the single source suppliers, though. We could have a 3-hour episode just me ranting about single source suppliers, but we'll leave that for another day.
Yeah, well, that'll be a good topic for one episode, I think, because I think there's a lot of stuff that fans may not necessarily understand with how this stuff shows up, and then even after it shows up, if it gets damaged in a race, what teams are allowed to do, or if the vendors will even allow them to repair it, or if the vendors will even take it back to be repaired. So that's, and I did a whole story for Race Car Engineering about Hendrick and some of the tools they have now, like some of the automated CMMs and things they have now, that their main purpose is, they just load up drawers full of, say, control arm brackets, and they just shuffle all these things through. So they have, 96 control arm brackets that they load up into their database, and it's supposedly all the same part from the same vendor, but if you have enough of them, there's enough variance where you can build different suspension geometry based on the same part number, just because you have so many parts.
And that's one of those things, right? And I'm sure there's still positions in these organizations, but quality control, right? When you were building stuff in-house in your own fab shop, in your own body guys, there was people there that had quality control looking over every single step of the process. And now, if you do have a quality control person, they look at it before it's on the car and they look at it when it's on the car. That's it.
No, I mean, that's kind of, and you can't reject stuff because it's like, as long as it fits whatever spec the vendor says it should be, you got to use it. And then you have to figure out, all right, everything should fit all the cars, but realistically, if you have a set of different parts, you have to figure out, hey, is this more of a short track part or is this more of a road course part? Like, do I care about this specific measurement? And that also kind of goes back to the 4 things you mentioned that you don't mess with. Those are often also the 4 things that you pay the most careful attention to make sure that you can get it exact down to, the 1,000th of an inch.
Right. And that goes back to, right, you talk about how many come from the single source suppliers and all of these parts and pieces. Well, if there's 38 cars and there's 5 pieces per car, you do the math, that's 200 minus some pieces out there. Sure, 10% of them are going to be off a little bit. Well, you put one of them on a car one week and then another one on the car the next week, and they both run like dog water. Like, you're not going to want to use that part anymore, but you can't go get more parts.
Yeah.
You already have them.
Yeah,
so
it's frustrating.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's tough. And it's especially tough that, something when it like body work and obviously on the Cup cars, the body also includes the underbody. So there's, that stuff is hugely important, where on an Xfinity car or truck, you're looking at a lot of the overbody aero, but on a Cup car, everything is centered off that rear diffuser because that's where you're going to make your downforce. So that's also tough because you got to make sure you pick the best possible combination of floor and strakes and all this other stuff, and then you're tweaking your entire suspension setup to get right nice and centered on that diffuser to optimize your downforce. And if you don't have a diffuser that fits well or the stays or something, and we've seen teams also tweaking stuff like that. I think we saw with Kyle Busch, he got a penalty because of, I think it was a splitter stay in that regard, but trying to twist a splitter stay, like that's, so there's that can be very frustrating. But I think that'll make a good kind of independent show on its own just to discuss some of the single source stuff. And I did want to get into a little bit of the Xfinity race because I thought the Xfinity race was pretty fun. But one of the things when it comes to Xfinity, which you probably have some knowledge of, is it seems like the ECR motors, like they're just like have some like magic, pixie dust or whatever for whenever they need to run wide open. Like, what's that? You've seen both of them up close, but what's the difference of running, a vanilla motor that's not an ECR motor compared to an ECR motor at a super speedway?
So I'm going to throw numbers out here, and I only know the intermediate stuff. I don't know the speedway stuff. Yeah. But we'll call it a bought, right? The B motor that you buy is mileaged out ECR lease motor. And that's what my team ran when we ran. That's what Young's Motorsports ran last year. And a lot of teams use them, right? Mario Goslin's teams, they all use them. But at a standard 1.5 mile, short track, road course, whatever, you're down about 15 horsepower between 4,500 to 6,500, and you're down about 10 horsepower above that. Okay. So that's kind of the numbers. So if I was a betting man, I would say at a speedway, you'd probably add 20% to those numbers. Right. Yeah. So, and you're running at above 6,500 that whole time. So I would say you're probably about 12 to 14 horsepower off. And ECR not only has the most power, they have the best fuel mileage, right? They have the most cars in the field. And so even if there is a couple, right, the Jordan Anderson cars, I think, struggled in qualifying a little bit. Well, the 2 and the 21 had half a second on 5th. So it's like, and honestly, the 2 and 21, I will honestly sit here and say, I don't think they get better motors than the rest of the ECR program. Yeah. They are the A, right? They get first choice at the beginning of the year, what motors they get to use and whatnot. But when it comes to the speedway stuff, like Brandonville had at one point the same motor that AJ won with at Daytona or Talladega, or Ross won at Daytona, I think. Maybe. But you get the red seal on it, and when you go to the motor, when you go to the chassis dyno, they type it in and shows you what races they've run. So we're getting motors that these other guys have won with, and obviously you have to run them a certain amount of miles per year, sealed motors and everything. So ECR is by far the best, right? And it's past speedways. They are the best everywhere. Like I remember Tyler Reddick went 72 laps on a tank of gas at Vegas one time. Everybody thought he was going to be 10 laps short. And in the 2 car, he ran that thing all the way out. So ECR has it figured out. You know, Richie was up there for a while, and Laney and Quizno and those guys up there have whatever they do it right.
Yeah, and I would agree with you that I don't think the RCR cars get any better motors. I think a lot of that obviously is also down to car setup and driver skill. So it's, you know, like Austin Hill is, you know, I don't know where he learned all this stuff or how he learned it, but, you know, he's obviously very skilled at, you know, running these cars. And then Jesse Love has very quickly picked up the same stuff. And now they bounce ideas off of each other. So I think over the last year, they've only gotten better. And then having that stuff to go on top of it, I think is just a big, big help. And I think another part of it is they run this stuff every week. A lot of these other cars will buy these motors for these one-off races. So they know, you know, all the points of when they need to save, how they need to save, when they need to go, you know, wide open or whatever else, which I think, you know, some of the guys that are using it for 3 races a year may not know.
And that's part of it, right? So it comes down to things just like an alternator switch, right? These guys that are running bot motors every week don't run an alternator switch. And some of the guys that run lease motors every week don't necessarily run an alternator switch. But you don't run the alternator switch, it's off on a qualifying lap. It's off on a green, white checkered. 5 to go into green, they turn it off, right? So just little things like that, tricks of the trade that these guys, you know, if Leland Honeyman's running the 70 this week and forgets to touch his alternator switch, well, that's a horsepower or two, right? It doesn't sound like a lot, but it could be the difference in towing a line or needing help to get up to be able to push. So I think that's a good point. Like there's a lot of tricks of the trade that they 100% get knowledge of and have to utilize.
No, and I think that's something that's important that we may take for granted, talking about something that we consider as simple as an alternator switch, but fans may not even realize how all this stuff is configured, because in a production car, you have an alternator and it just works because you have a regulator that's built inside of the case of the alternator, and there's an ECU that controls all that stuff, where in a race car, especially in NASCAR, you have an alternator, but all the electronics are outside of the alternator. So you have this regulator that sits usually in the car, I think, like in the what would be considered like off the tunnel maybe, or maybe on the dash, I don't know, you know, wherever somebody places, and then you have a switch that's based on that. So then like this whole deal on the production car, that there's a big computer that tells it, you know, what to do if you have running the AC, if you're running the radio. Here in the race car, it's more focused on if you're running this many RPM, this is what it's doing, but then you can also turn it off completely. And
and that's part of the thing, right? You ever hear a guy that's saying he's low on voltage, right? So they tell him, turn off the AC, turn off all your driver stuff, because they need all of that power to go to the motor. And a little side note about your production car. We were up at VIR this past summer, and I got to sit in Patrick Gallagher's Turner Motorsport car after the race. And I mean, the only thing I've ever raced is a late model. That thing had one switch and an ignition. And that thing had 35 buttons. And I was like, what does this one do? What does this one do? The door popped right off and climbed in. Like those things are crazy. Like a computer in the dash.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a wild difference. And that's like, so Patrick Gallagher races in IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship, which is where I cruise. So he works on a BMW GT3 car. I work on a Lexus GT3 car. So we race, you know, same stuff against same stuff. But even in those classes, like everything in NASCAR is standardized. But even like in our classes, we're racing heads up, and it's just cars at the same speed. But his steering wheel might have 24 buttons, but our steering wheel might have 22, and there's like a bunch of different functions. So there's a lot of stuff that's very, very programmable in GT3 cars. So that's always a jump, especially when NASCAR guys come over. But also the cool thing is that I bet that if you got the basics of like, here's how to run the car, you could go out on track and give it a couple of laps, and it wouldn't be any more complicated to drive than that late model, because as a lot of my engineering friends say, it's just 4 tires and physics. And I think anybody that's skilled enough to recognize how a car handles will be able to do it, whether it's in a GT3 car or, you know, an Xfinity car or a late model or whatever else. And it's fascinating because a lot of the sports car drivers that I've worked with in IMSA or know in IMSA have a blast going to drive this other stuff. And I think I've even had conversations with Pat about driving Xfinity cars and all this other stuff of like, you know, it's like a lot of fun for these guys because it's just so raw.
And I think Jack Hawksworth would be a great one to talk to, right? I think he's him and probably Justin Marks are probably the two guys that have gotten in quality Xfinity equipment and not, middle to back of the pack stuff. So I'd be very curious to see their kind of perspective versus a Patrick or a Catherine or anybody else that comes over and hops in the middle of the pack stuff. Because I'm sure it drives obviously better and different, and see what their input is and the difference between the two.
And I think that's also a big difference. And, we've seen some of the stuff, especially with Catherine lately, running some of the JR stuff. And that's like they've, built up their program decently well, but that's still kind of a midfieldish Xfinity, car that she would be, hopping in there versus like Jack Hawksworth when he came over and ran a Gibbs car. That's like, the best of the best. And for him, like running that car, he's coming into not only the car and having enough resources for people to be able to understand the feedback he's giving them, but also having a good pit crew, because I think that plays a big part, especially if you're jumping into this stuff. If you can get a car that you can run out in clean air and tweak to your liking versus a car that might be in clean air on a pit cycle, but then in traffic over here, and you're just trying to learn it, like it can be a big, big impact. But I know just talking to Jack, he's literally like always trying to get these people to like put him in one of these cars whenever it's possible, especially with stuff like, street courses now being in NASCAR and, like Chicago and Mexico City and all that stuff. And I was a big proponent of that. I was like, anybody that would listen to me, Jack and Ben Barnico and some of these other guys I work with, I was like, these guys, like, street courses are their bread and butter. Like we've won so many street course races, and it's funny because it's a similar skill set to what a lot of the oval guys have, is because they're able to run the street courses like right on the wall. So they're able to make up that little bit of time. And like, I know, like when the car comes back, like the rear quarter and even the wing itself, like the vinyl will be scraped off because that's where they are on the wall, but they squeeze out 3 or 4 tenths. So like, especially for a cup car, because there are a lot of similarities, geometry wise and all this other stuff. But, it's interesting to see. But that's also the other thing of like having back marker cars that you go into, like, somebody like Pat may go into, or Catherine, mid-level. It's a very, very different scenario, but they still seemingly have fun and enjoy the experience because it's such a cool environment.
I think the one person I talked to was Josh Bilicki when he ran the Gibbs car last year, and he ran very respectable. I think he ran top 5 all day. I think he won a stage. And like, what's the difference? And he's like, they just race harder for 20th. Like they just race way harder. And so when you are racing that hard for 20th, when you get in a good car and you have that opportunity, and I think we've seen a handful of guys now that are in Cup all run mid-pack equipment and get into good cars, it's easier. And not just because you're driving a faster car, but you're not having to drive your ass off for 300 miles. Right? So, and I think that's kind of where, like, if you go put some of these guys with some experience, right? A Bilicki, Patrick or Catherine or any of them, now that they have some experience with the cars and then how they drive and how they handle, and then you go put them in a better version. Like if you go put any of those guys up in a Gibbs car right now, I think they run more than respectable.
Sure. Yeah. No. And I mean, I could see that. And that's the thing. I think a lot of it, we see a lot of that car quality stuff more in Xfinity, going down to trucks, and then obviously to ARCA versus like Cup. Now Cup, like, it's very, very close, but in Xfinity and especially in ARCA, which I always find fascinating watching those races, like watching even, the stuff this weekend of like the speed differential. I'm like, why? Like that's one thing I tweeted out, is like, I don't understand. Like, maybe it's my personal pride, but I don't understand that I could ever go out there knowing that I don't have a car, or I don't have the skill set to run closer than 7 seconds from the pole speed at a place like Rockingham or going to Talladega. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me.
So if I was a betting man, I would say that when ARCA races on Fox and FS1 and these other networks that have a TV contract aligned with them, they have a set number. They only get paid if they have a full field. And that probably drops off per car that you are below a full field. Sure. And so I would assume that the sanctioning body, whoever does run ARCA, is begging these teams to put more effort in and to show up. because they need the car count.
Sure.
With that being said, there is absolutely nothing more dangerous than I tweeted out last week. There was a car 11 seconds off at Rockingham.
That's like a 23, 24 second lap in an ARCA car.
Qualifying lap is 22.8.
That is wild. Yeah, that's like really dangerous. Yeah.
Like you go to most tracks, I think it's within 8% of the pole speed or something like that, which is more than enough time, right? Or whatever the time is. It's like Darlington, you can be 6.5 seconds off.
Yeah.
You're still okay. And this guy was 50% of the time.
I just don't understand. Like
how?
But yeah, like it's like I understand if the series has incentive to attract more competitors, but me as a competitor, you as a competitor, I just I understand running, like in the Xfinity series, if you're a 25th or 30th place car, okay, that's good, but you're still running within a second or two, or sometimes less than a second of the leaders. But here, this is just like at Phoenix last year, I sat in the stands and watched the Xfinity race. And I was like, this is wild, because I watched the ARCA race, not the Xfinity race, but it was I think it was like Xfinity practice and then the ARCA race, and it was just jarring to see, because like Xfinity back markers are still on pace. Like you can't tell visually, like you can't just visually point out to a person that's getting like passed because they're a back marker, like But in ARCA, like it's literally like you have this person in the bottom lane, and it looks like they're parked or they're about to pit, but no, that's just their lap time.
And the biggest reason for that is because when ARCA obviously had the Ilmor motors for a long time, and to keep car counts high, they went with a motor package that allows them to run different motors, which goes back to the SB2, which was a thing, 10, 15 years ago. And so ARCA is allowing these guys to put in less money just to show up.
Yeah.
And I don't fault, Andy Hillenberg and Wayne Peterson. These guys, I mean, they're making a living.
Yeah.
And if you want to make a living doing this, go buy some late models, put a crate motor in it, and go sell rides for $5-10 grand.
Yeah.
Because it's dangerous. It's dangerous. It's
like
bad.
And I understand like wanting to be on TV, but I don't get the benefit of wanting to be on TV for something that looks embarrassing, basically. Like if you have like a set amount of resources, like you say, go run a late model. Like you could probably, with the same money, run a competitive late model program and go find races to run. But I guess the TV or whatever, being in the same environment maybe as like Cup and Xfinity maybe is attractive to some of these people, I think. And I think that's probably maybe a big part of it. They just want to be in the same area, same track, or I don't know.
And I think the ARCA Daytona test is the catalyst of it all, right? Yeah. You can go run the ARCA Daytona test for $5-10 grand and go run the race for $35-40 grand in a dog crap car. Well, now that you've run Daytona, you're cleared for everything.
Wow. That is wild.
When you pay 40 grand to run Daytona for this guy that has a 35th place car and he has nobody going to drive at Toledo, and he calls you and says, hey man, give me a couple grand, you can come run Toledo, and then starts and parks it after 25 laps.
Yeah.
What good does that do for the sport?
It's not productive.
Like these guys, and I know quite a few ARCA teams that their budget comes off of how many people they have leased out the car at the ARCA Daytona test.
Yeah,
like that is their yearly budget.
That's
because
wild.
They're selling so many rides.
That is wild.
ARCA it's a whole another problem. I mean, there's only been one team to put an effort in the series consistently for the last decade, and they just sold, which they sold to Nick Tucker. Nick Tucker's going to do a good job of keeping it race winning, but it's they're tough, the only team.
Yeah, and you got like recently, I guess you have like Pinnacle and some of these other ones that are, now but that's only been like the last couple of years where you've had like 2 or 3 teams that are trying. And obviously JGR that brings just like spaceships.
I was giving Brent Cruz crap after Rockingham. I was like, man, you qualified in the hole-in-one. Like he's like, yeah. I was like, you should. Like, if you didn't, I'd be mad at you.
Yeah, like there's no other reasoning like for any of this. Like
Right.
it's fascinating, but that was just a whole fascinating thing. That it was back to back. I think that was ARCA East at Rockingham, and then it was like big ARCA here at Talladega. But it was just fascinating to see both and just how it like all works and like the mistakes people made, which also impressed me with Cletus McFarland finishing top 10, running on 7 cylinders, which I think is good to see, like that he was able to do that, being kind of like an amateur racer of racing Crown Vics or whatever for fun,
Mhm.
but also I think shows like the level of car in ARCA where
Yeah.
a YouTuber that studied racing can show up and run top 10 in a hurt car.
Yeah,
So
and that's the thing, right? Is I think Mark Rett has done a
yeah.
phenomenal job. Everything he runs, he brings good
Mhm.
stuff. Super late miles. I mean, ran the Xfinity car with Noah last year, I think.
Mhm.
So everything Mark Rett and Terry Jones do, they do a good job in. And so when they do show up to an ARCA race, they're competitive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like if you look at the ARCA field, there was 4 Venturini cars, 2 Nitro cars, a
Yep.
Gibbs car, a Pinnacle car,
Yep.
and a Rhett Jones car.
Yeah.
And I'd be willing to bet 80%, probably 8 of those 10 finish in the top 10 if I had the list in front of me.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, one of the cars had like some kind of issue that finished like 20th, but all of the rest of those finished like in the top 8, I think. Yeah.
And those are the only ones putting a genuine effort in.
Yeah. No, it's tough.
Have you been
Just
to an ARC through like Architect?
I have not, but it's the photos I've seen seem very I say adaptable to do whatever you want to do.
When that garage opens in Charlotte in May, I want you to go in there
All
and I
right.
want you to just
Observe.
just
Yeah.
take a look.
No, it seems, and like that series seems like a good opportunity to do a lot of stuff at a reasonable price. I think it just needs a little bit of reconfiguration.
That's a word. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember looking, I can't remember, it's probably a year and a half ago, 2 years now. You win 4,500 when they ran New Smyrna. You made 4,500 for winning the race.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not the team's fault. Like it's the same reason why Brandon Motorsports went Xfinity racing instead of truck racing, right?
Yeah.
It costs the same amount per race to go run a truck race and as an Xfinity race, and you get paid 35% more.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's like 50% more.
Yeah.
So you can't blame these guys for not wanting to put the effort in, right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's just
the math has to work. Yeah.
Right.
No, I mean, that makes sense. And I know that ARCA has like a year-end fund, and I think that a lot of incentive for the people that do start in parks and stuff like that is they can make up some of it back on the year-end fund as long as they get some points to be in the top 15 or whatever it is. I don't know exactly, but I've heard stories of that, and that'll be interesting to see. But going back to kind of wrap up and go back to the beginning, I know you're like an aspiring video producer now. So I've seen a little bit of the stuff. I watched the first kind of golf course. So you have this shake and bake sports thing now.
Yeah.
So is this solely going to be like golf focused with the guys, or is this going to like be like a bigger thing? So you have a YouTube channel, Instagram, all these other kind of social media outlets. Like what's the plan here?
So the main goal is to show the guys' personalities off the racetrack. We started with golf because that's something we always do together and we just enjoy it. And we kind of were able to turn speed golf into kind of a NASCAR oriented thing. And I think it's going to be golf like the first month and a half or two.
Okay.
But we're doing a lot of cool things. We're going out to Charlotte Motor Speedway here soon, and we're going to film golfing. Daniel really wants to try to do a hole-in-one challenge from the spotter stand, which I think is going to be a little dangerous.
That's a long distance.
It's a long distance. But they go fishing a lot. They hang out. They play a lot of Fortnite. So it's just about trying to get everyone in the right environment. And obviously for reasons, we're not all the same on camera as we are off camera.
Sure.
You have to clean it up a bit, but we're all just such good friends. And I think everyone saw that with Jesse and Connor and how they each handled that situation Saturday. I think shows their maturity and their friendship and just how good of friends they are and how you can race somebody and still hang out with them. And they're not 21 yet, but if you and I hung out and we'd go get a beer.
No, I mean, that's just how it goes. Yeah. And I mean, that's cool. I always say that I'm like, the technical guy, and obviously everything we're discussing here is very technical. But for me, I think the like catalyst for growth, and not even just racing, just in sports in general, is personalities. And like, I was never a big golf person, but Full Swing came out on Netflix. Yep. And I started watching that. And now when I see golf on TV, I stick around because like, I know that guy. I like that guy, like what he said or what he did, like, and obviously it may not be the full picture, but it was interesting enough for me to connect. And that's, I think, missing with a lot of the guys like in racing. And I think, having people like Connor and Jesse and Daniel and all these younger guys that are, genuinely fast people in Xfinity that usually only get ask questions about how they made their qualifying lap or how they won or whatever. I think having another side is very helpful.
And I think, I'll preface this by saying Christopher Bell is one of the top 3 most talented drivers in the sport, right? Christopher Bell will never be a top 3 paid driver in the sport, ever. And it's because he doesn't have a fan base. And part of that might be by design, part of it might not be, but he's never going to have the fan base that some of these other guys have that have. Denny, love him or hate him, speaks his mind. And right now in today's world, if you ask somebody to name a NASCAR driver, they're going to say Denny Hamlin, Kyle Larson, Chase Elliott, maybe Kyle.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the thing that's tough is there's all this training, all this kind of, you have to have media training, PR training, all this other stuff. And it's a tough balance to strike. And I've seen some of the stuff from the inside, and it can be, huge risk, small reward scenario to show your personality, depending on who you're dealing with on the corporate side. So that's kind of hard. So I understand where somebody like Christopher Bell is coming from, but I've also seen the success that, Denny has had specifically of like, you go to the track at driver intros, and depending on what track you're at, he might get more boos than cheers when he gets announced. But then when he wins, there are a lot of cheers usually. So it's like, and it goes back and forth. And, obviously stuff on social media can get volatile, and, some of the comments that people leave him and when they get mad, but people know who he is and people know where he stands. And if you look at, like Actions Detrimental, some of the feedback that they get is like, hey, I hated you as a driver, but I listened to your stuff now, and you're my second, like the second driver I cheer for if my driver doesn't do well, like after just completely hating him. So I think that's a big part of it.
And I think Denny is the most important person in our sport right now, right? For obvious reasons of what's going on outside of the racetrack, but for his voice to the NASCAR community, to the fans, to everybody else, Denny is the most important person. Like he has the insight from team ownership. He has the insight from as a fan doing the podcast. He has insight as a driver. What he says carries a lot of weight. And this actually leads me to my next point, because obviously he's going to be talking about it on his podcast, but I'm so excited to hear about this. But they talked about the run what you brung at Wilkesboro.
Yeah, sure.
And I'd be very curious to know why he was for it or why he was against it.
Yeah.
But his personality just speaks volumes as to what Lewis Hamilton is probably the most popular in Formula One because he's a cool guy.
Yeah.
He hangs out with supermodels and drives fast cars off the racetrack. I mean, he's a social icon, right?
Yeah.
That's why Lewis
stuff. Yeah.
And if you look at football, right? I'm an Eagles fan, so I'll argue Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts is a God-fearing man whose work ethic speaks volumes, and people resonate with that. And so for these guys, Connor, Jesse, Daniel, myself, Will, Rip, these guys are a part of it. If we can just show one person, two people, the personality that these guys have off the track, and that they're just genuinely fun people. And in my mind, they're still kids, but they're grown-ass adults. And they have a great relationship with each other, and we just have a lot of fun, filming content.
No, I mean I think that's important. Going back to all those examples, is there in racing, especially like lately, and it's like a big picture thing of like sponsorship and all this stuff. Like you got to be in this box. It's hard to do anything else. But I think if you do take that risk to show that personality, get into that stuff, it not only like builds your fan base, but it can also help on the business end. If you're able to show something to the partners and be like, hey, I'm going to do this event and I'm going to invite whatever and, do an appearance, and you have, dozens and dozens or hundreds of people to show up, it's different than if people are just showing up because, you drive a Chevy, you drive a Ford, you drive a Toyota just to look at the car or whatever else. So that's pretty significant. And I would agree on the points like regarding Denny, like, and I would add to that, he better understands the media side now than a lot of other drivers too, because of the podcast. Just going and sitting down and talking with him and Jared and Travis, like they have this, very, very advanced setup. But because of that podcast, he now understands that like what people from my side and other people that are media that cover the series, what they're looking at. And I think it's opened up his eyes on what he's willing to share. And that's allowed him to share more information. So I think and I would agree with you that he's probably the most important like driver in NASCAR right now because of all those aspects. And just because of the investment like he's given into the sport.
Absolutely.
Even today, I talked about some of the pit stops that like the PDG group has done, which is the development pit crew group for 2311. And, JJ Yeley had people from that group. So he's getting, a high level pit crew just because 2311 has developed their pit department so far that they want to give these guys just time at the track.
Yeah.
And, and the reason they're doing that is because they want to help with the development of Corey Haim, because that's the pit crew that he's going to get. So like he's investing in a lot of like different angles from the sport. So I would agree with that in a lot of regards. And I would agree on the personality front. Like even for me, as a mechanic pit crew guy on the IMSA side, I found that I could build with that because sports car racing is even more, I would say, strict from some of the PR angles than NASCAR, because a lot of it's very customer facing because you have all these pro-am classes and all this stuff. Right. So I carefully tried to carve that niche out, but I didn't have to do anything special. Like I started a lot of it with just like food that I like. And then, but then over time I pushed the limits a little bit more to expose personality. And I think that's going to be a big benefit, especially knowing some of these guys, seeing them around since they were kids and now they're adults and racing and winning, and running into them in all these places and all this cool stuff they do. Like I ran into Daniel at Millbridge maybe a week or, week and a half ago, and he's just basically doing it for fun. Like, but that's like something that the average person may not know. And he's, they're having fun talking with these younger kids that are running, some of the smaller stuff. And like, it's like a cool aspect of something that he does and that, he's enjoying, but also like giving back to like the racing community at large.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, I'll just throw this out there. It's been an idea that we've had, and, Rip will probably be mad at me for sharing it, but we would love, App State has a specific football to pit crew program.
Yeah.
Nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
Nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
And for Shake and Bake Sports, I think it would be the coolest send off for these guys to, their playing careers are over. You go to App State, there's 120 people on their football teams. 2 might make the NFL.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so these guys are, what do they do next? And a lot of them end up in the pit crew stuff, right? Whether it's for a big team, whether it's for Pop Tart or for Pat Cole or whatever it is, they end up in the pit crew system. And I think that's a really cool, it was actually Rip's idea, but it's a really cool show or it's story that everyone can see. And I think that's kind of where Shake and Bake goes, just beyond golf, beyond the guys and what it can be.
Yeah, no, and that's right along the lines of everything I've been doing as far as the pit crew stuff specifically, because like I've talked to a lot of these other people and shared a lot of like information I've collected, because I think the way I look at it is, you may have 36 drivers on any given weekend, but if you include the pit crews, you have now a multiplier of 5 or 6 per team of personalities that you could cover. And what I found is that I've done all this research, like most of the Cup guys, I've built profiles on them, like personality information, school information, where they've been, wins, championships, all this other stuff. And I've gladly shared it with other people, because what I found is that if TV starts talking about it or a bigger like outlet starts talking about it, then people are looking for it. So they'll come to read my stuff or watch my stuff or listen to this stuff. So I think, that you guys are even considering that, I think is a cool angle. And like, it's something that I think should be explored more, and hopefully, keep pushing others to kind of get into it. But I'm very interested to see. So you guys had your kind of intro episode, and you guys played at a golf course. I think you played in Statesville or somewhere around here. And then you guys, one of the guys did the Adaptive Golf Open a few days ago, right?
Yeah. So that was really cool. His guy's name's Alex Forey. He's actually the club professional at the 500 Club, which a lot of drivers, Rick Allen, Michael Waltrip, Big Stenhouse, those guys own. But he has one arm. He was born in Ukraine. Due to the effects from Chernobyl and everything, he was born with without an upper cliff or something up here, and with only one arm. But he is badass dude. Like, he can beat me. He'll beat me 10 times out of 10 on a golf course. Like, he is that good. And so we went down to Georgia, and the USGA offers this Adaptive Open, and so for people with upper limb disabilities, lower limb disabilities, cognitive disabilities, spinal disabilities, but it gives them an opportunity to go play competitive golf, and their championships in Washington, D.C., I think in June. So really cool thing that they do. And we had the opportunity to film it and showcase Alex and his round. And it's really cool. Just get outside of NASCAR a little bit and showcase some other athletes.
That's badass. Well, I'll put a link to some of those videos below whenever this uploads fully to YouTube. I'm still figuring all this stuff out. So kind of like your director, producer role with some of this stuff. So I'll put a link to some of the shake and bake stuff. And I'm sure you guys will have like another kind of group video coming soon at some point in addition to all that stuff. So people can go to the link to find that and subscribe. But I think this is probably a good point for us to wrap up. I appreciate you coming on so quickly. After I saw the DQ, I was like, I know exactly who I want to talk to. Somebody that's won at Talladega and somebody that knows a lot of technical info that I can text quickly. But I appreciate everybody tuning in to the Bozi Breakdown. Thank you to Colin Fern, who was an awesome guest tonight. Like, subscribe, do all this stuff. Leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts so we can get more of these episodes out. And I will see you guys soon.